Welcome back to For the Record. I'm your host, Justin Allen Rose, and for this episode, you can hear the conversation that I recently had with Christopher Wilson, who is the CEO of EyesOver and Stratus Intelligence. Chris and I talked about a recent poll released by Stratus Intelligence, which a lot of people are claiming flipped the GOP race for Oklahoma governor on its head. Enjoy. First and foremost, just tell us a little bit about your organization, Chris, and tell us, how long you've been conducting polls here, specifically toward Oklahoma.
Well, I've been in survey research since 1992 when I graduated from the University of Oklahoma. I went from OU out to Georgetown and came back and worked here. So I've been doing work in polling and what initially was called predictive econometrics is now called data analytics for almost 3 decades. I did not get involved in Oklahoma politics for a long time just because, candidly, I lived here. So did not do any major races in the state until Kevin Stitt's race. And so it was, and I'll point out because I think it's important, we were the only pollster to accurately call both Stitt's win and the amount of win he had in 2022. I worked on this race in 2018. I worked for him. I worked for Stephanie Bice in 2020 when she won back the 5th district. And at EyesOver and Stratus Intelligence, we combine traditional survey research with artificial intelligence-powered sentiment analysis. And we give campaigns real-time insight to what voters, the public, consumers are thinking, and more importantly, why they're thinking that and the emotion behind it.
Why do you think your company, the company, was the only one to really get it right for Kevin Stitt?
It's a great question. I get asked it all the time. And I think there are 2 types of mistakes that can be made when it comes to survey research. There are what I'll refer to as crimes of omission and crimes of commission. And so without casting aspersions, I will just simply say that we were talking to the voters that we had modeled that were likely to vote in 2022. And but having said that, I at no point had the race close. I at no point had Kevin Stitt down. It was stunning to me the amount of polling firms that had Kevin Stitt losing whenever it was. I would have put any amount of money on the fact that he wasn't going to lose. It's Oklahoma, for crying out loud. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that when you are a political pollster, it's kind of like being a football coach. You either win or you get fired. And if I had told Kevin Stitt he was going to win and he had lost, I would have been fired. Whereas if you do it for a media firm or just for a group of lobbyists or things like that, they kind of keep asking you back. And so you can be wrong over and over and over again. And there's some really famous examples of polling firms in Oklahoma who probably haven't been right since the late 90s, but still get hired. And so it's God bless them, but I could not survive in that way.
And so that was in 2022 in terms of Kevin Stitt and the polling you did for him. Now we're about 4 years out from that, heading into 2026. And now a new poll has just been released from your company talking about maybe this race is now flipped on its head, or at least the way people thought it was going to go with Gittner Drummond, especially with now former House Speaker Charles McCall. Tell us a little bit about those findings.
It has. And we've been tracking this race regularly for the entire year. I got to know Charles McCall really well a few years back and agreed to work with him on his campaign for governor. And so then after he went on the air in late September with his now famous banana ad, it's gotten national press. We wanted to measure the impact the media buys were having, both on his numbers and candidly on Gittner Drummond's and just on the race in general. We wanted to understand how voters were reacting to the framing of the race. We wanted to understand the sort of the evolution of it between a Trump-aligned conservative and who I believe Charles McCall is, and Gittner Drummond, who I believe is sort of a moderate insider. And so the short version of what the polling said to me is McCall is now the clear frontrunner. And he wasn't. As you said, it sort of turned the conventional wisdom on its head because there were numbers that came out early on that had Gittner Drummond up by 40 or 50 points by some firm. And now McCall is leading the ballot test, every ballot test we ran, head-to-head, runoff, full ballot. He surged 12 points in 3 weeks. And it shows the power of powerful advertising, but also it shows the power of a strong candidate. And the other thing that we've seen is Gittner Drummond's numbers are collapsing, especially with voters who previously saw him as a safe choice. And I think that's a key distinction, is the kind of the redefinition of the race for governor. And you don't typically see that this early.
Oh, why do you think we're seeing it this early? Is it because is it a wide open race and we're not seeing an incumbent like we had Sid in 2022?
Usually primary voters start paying attention around filing deadlines or after session ends or things like that. But I think the paid media here moved the needle early. And Drummond's inability to define himself let those numbers harden fast. Now, let's be clear, Drummond did go on the air first. And so he kind of forced the hands of the other campaigns to also go on the air. But in doing so, I think his campaign or he did himself a disservice, one or the other. And so what that did whenever Charles went on is it caused voters to clarify and classify the race early on. And so what you have on one side is sort of a Donald Trump aligned conservative in Charles McCall and sort of a moderate to even liberal insider in Gittner Drummond. And I believe once the race is defined on those terms, it is very, very difficult to redefine it.
So, what do you think this race is going to be defined on when it comes to that GOP primary coming up? What is it, June of next year?
It is. It's June of next year. And what will be defined on? I don't know that there is a lot of room for additional definition. I think the aspect of Republican primary voters is they want to see who the conservative is. They want to see who represents their values. But even more so, they want to see who kind of has a steady hand of leadership. And you can go back to Republican primaries and look at Frank Keating and Mary Fallon and Kevin Stitt. And every one of them were seen as not necessarily the most conservative, although they probably each of them were in their races. But they were seen as the ones who were kind of the adult in the room, the one who stood tall and had a steady hand whenever there were challenges that were presented. And I think that has had a little bit of that's what's caused definition here. There's been the Drummond campaign has had challenges in terms of his wife made a donation to Joe Biden. Well, there was a donation made in his name to Joe Biden, and he blamed it on his wife. And he said he didn't do it, but he did do it, but it was his wife who did it, and he asked for his money back. Little things like that are definitional, and it's really tough to redefine a race once the voters begin to understand that, well, something's a little bit strange here. And then we have Charles McCall, who is a steady hand of leadership, and that is what we are looking for in a governor, and in the same mold that you had in Kevin Stitt.
A lot of the stuff you mentioned about, Drummond allegedly donating to, Biden and what have you. And I saw some other things too, I think this past weekend about his wife donating to a Democrat in Texas, if I'm not mistaken. But a lot of those things are...
MJ Hager, a Democrat candidate for Senate, right. Yeah.
And so a lot of these things that I see those things too, but a lot of them are just on social media. And it's not on, let's say, the ABC, the CBSs of the local television stations. Like my parents, they don't have internet, so they're not getting all this information. Do you think it's social media is really going to drive this race a little bit?
It is, because my bet is your parents have cell phones, and they probably can access Facebook and X and other platforms on their cell phones. And what we have seen over the course of the last probably 3 to 4 cycles. I would say even go back to 2016. In 2016, I served as head of polling and data for the Cruz for President campaign. And what was really fascinating for me, even back then, that seems like years ago now, though it feels like yesterday also, was the Google Trends numbers on election day on a state-by-state basis were more accurate than our polling was. And what that was people voting or searching online for how do I vote for Donald Trump? How do I vote for Ted Cruz? How do I vote for Marco Rubio? Not a lot of how do I vote for Jeb Bush, but there were a couple. And sorry, inside joke. But from that, it gets down to it's sort of crystallized in my mind. I'm actually writing a book about this right now. Is that this is a leading indicator to polling. And so what we now see is online conversation. You mentioned you saw the MJ Hager donation this week. That came from one influencer. I didn't even know that. That came from one influencer who lives up in Tulsa who has 120,000 followers. The guy's named Calvin Coolidge Project. And he was able to take that, and now probably everybody who pays attention in politics in the states knows about it. And I refer to people like that as micro-influencers. They can have an outsized influence in a race. It's sort of like what pastors or mayors or football coaches used to be, and now they've moved into that role. And so it showed that level of importance. And that was this week. Last week it was as his wife gave to the Lincoln Project, and which is a very anti-Trump, never Trump type of organization. So these things start to pile on each other. It gets back to your original question, is Drummond's inability to define himself let others define him for himself. And that is a deadly position to be in politics, whether you're running for governor or city council. You cannot let your opponent or the people who are against you define you. And that's what's occurred here. And so getting back to the genesis of the question is, yes, I do believe that social media and online conversations are the new survey research. The days of people answering their phone from an unknown call and spending 30 minutes during dinner telling me what they are going to do or how they feel are kind of moving behind us. And that's why the ability to ingest data, and to be clear, the polling we did was that old-fashioned way, the legacy way. You can still do it if you do enough of them. We did over 800 calls and interviews, or 800 interviews, I should say, not all calls. But the ability to ingest data, and as I said, when I do something for the president, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of pieces of data that we ingest. And it is far more accurate and far more telling and far more directional than anything we'd ever do from a traditional research standpoint.
A lot of people recently in politics, I know you heard this too, really cast doubt on polling, especially this past election cycle, what have you. And that was sort of what I saw from the Drummond campaign when this poll came out. Really kind of throws some doubt on it. But now we got this new poll released this week, if I'm not mistaken. Have you had a chance to look at that poll?
I have. And what's interesting about it is the consistency of it. Different methodologies, but same trend. And the trend is McCall's rising, Drummond is fading. And that's how you know it's not a one-off. And you're seeing the same thing in our other internal tracking polls, too. This was the second poll in a row in which we had seen that trend occur. And so if you see a trend in which one poll shows a slight increase, the next one shows a bigger increase, and then another one shows a huge decrease, something's really weird. But this is 3 polls in a row in which we've seen the same level of trajectory. And that's how you know it's not a one-off. You're seeing the same thing in other polls as well.
Do you see any issues the people you are interviewing are harping on? Is it just how conservative somebody is, or are there other issues at play?
Gosh, that is a great question. And I think the one thing that I find right now that people in Oklahoma care about is just a adult in the room. And it is, without casting aspersions on any former statewide officials, and I'll put it that way, there has been some disconcertion with fights that have occurred, and what people have seen is just little kind of being silly quabbles. And I believe Stitt has done a great job. And let me be clear, Governor Stitt is still the most popular elected official in the state of Oklahoma. And he has been during his entire governorship. And I think he's done an amazing job. And so people are looking for someone to fulfill that same legacy that Kevin Stitt has. Someone who is an adult, who doesn't bow down to political insiders, who will do what he believes is the right thing, no matter who he may be taking on. And let's be honest. Governor Stitt has not always been on the same side as the political leadership in this party. He's gotten into fights with different groups in the state. But every time he's done that, I can tell you, I know him very well, he's done that because he believes it is the right thing to do. And voters appreciate that. They don't appreciate what's going on in Washington right now, where you've got the shutdown and Democrats keep voting against it because they feel like it's the only way they can get leverage. Voters reject that sort of political partisanship. And Kevin Stitt has risen above that. And so that's what we see in Charles McCall, and that's what I believe they're looking for. And frankly, if there's one trend that's unmistakable in both our survey and the coefficient survey that just came out, it's that undecided voters are moving. And they're moving away from Drummond. The consistency across firms gives us internally, and to be clear, if I didn't state it enough early on, I work for Charles McCall. Consistency across firms gives us more confidence in that. And I think the one thing that all these polls make clear is that Charles McCall is the conservative default for a big chunk of the Republican electorate. The open question here is how quickly the rest of the field coalesces or whether they fracture. And if they fracture, I think you could see Charles McCall begin a path that avoids a runoff entirely. And who would have believed that when you had public polls coming out showing Ginter Drummond up with a 50-point lead? And now, with this current trend, I believe Charles McCall is on a trajectory that is pretty solid.
Are we reading too much into this polling? What is it, about 8 months out to the GOP primary? Are we reading too much into it, or are you feeling pretty solid because of this other poll really showing, those 3 polls showing kind of the same thing?
You know, anything can happen. And as has been pointed out multiple times, I worked for Ron DeSantis in 2024. And right after the November elections of 2022, Ron DeSantis had a huge lead in the race for president. And he had a huge loss in Iowa in 2024. So a year and a few months can make a huge difference. There's no question about it. But there's no Donald Trump in this race. And Donald Trump is a unique figure, and is a great president. And so I think what I believe in this is that there is solidity behind it, because when Republican primary voters make a decision that is based on an ideological definition, and I'm not just talking about McCall here, although that definition has occurred, but there's also been the definition around Drummond based on things like suing to stop school choice, suing to stop gender mutilation surgeries, again, being a Biden donor, a Lincoln Project donor, donating to Democrat candidates like for Senate in 2018. All those things come together to form an opinion in voters' minds that I think is very difficult to get beyond. And so because of that, yeah, we'll still spend millions of dollars spent. And I apologize to all your viewers for all the TV ads they're going to have to sit through over the next few months. But having said that, you know what's interesting about Oklahoma is the best time to communicate to voters is during the fall of football games. Because everybody these days has streaming TV, and there's only two things you don't stream, that you don't record and then stream later. And it is, number one, sports, and number two, the news. So you're safe, and OU football is safe. And so that's why I was talking to somebody yesterday. I said, yeah, I watched the OU Texas game, and I saw like 4 Charles McCall ads. I'm like, yeah, I know. So did everybody else in the state. And you can't repeat that after November, December. I mean, maybe some bowl games in January. But after that, that goes away, and people pay attention to the legislature. And then we get back into it to May and June. It's really tough to have an impact with voters in the summer going into these primaries. Think about it, Texas has a March primary. It's a lot easier there. I do a lot of work in Texas. But in Oklahoma, people go off on vacation. They're at their lake house or whatever, hanging out in Lake Latonka. That's what I used to do in Lawton. And, it's a lot tougher to get people to watch TV and pay attention to TV ads.
I didn't even think about that, how important this fall is going to be to crafting that image of each candidate. Now, gearing towards the end of the interview, I have to ask this. Any sort of polling being done on the Democratic side in terms of language being said? Munson, also a Lawton native, what have you, the only Democrat so far in the race. Let's say McCall runs away with it, beats Gittner Drummond out in the GOP primary. Do you see that just a notion of being conservative really carrying McCall? Of course, there's other policy issues as well, but the notion of him being conservative will carry him to November ahead of Munson, let's say.
There's a reason why a Democrat has not won a statewide race since Brad Henry. And there probably won't be another Democrat win a statewide race in Oklahoma, perhaps in our lifetimes, because Democrats ruled Oklahoma for almost 100 years. And it has moved to the point that Oklahoma has won 2 states in which President Trump won every single one of our 77 counties, in which he won all the counties. And no, there's not. And that's, going back to what you asked me at the beginning about why I knew my numbers were right on Governor Stitt in 2022. Because, when every other poll had it closer, had Hoffmeister winning. And I did have some questions internally, like, wow, am I doing something wrong here? The reason why I knew I wasn't doing anything wrong is because the Democratic Party, what's known as the Democratic Governors Association, DGA, never came in and spent a single dime on Joy Hoffmeister. If they thought they had any chance at all to win, they would have spent money, just like they did for Drew Edmondson in 2018. They actually spent a pretty good amount of money. No, you will not see the Democratic Party in 2026 spend a single dime in the state of Oklahoma.
Any last thoughts, Chris, on polling or anything we talked about at all, the election?
I just want to say, whenever I found out that you guys reached out, and it was KSWO, I couldn't wait to get on. I'm born and raised in Lawton, and so miss it there. I still have family there, and graduated from Eisenhower High School. So appreciate everything Lawton has done for me in my life, and appreciate you having me on.
Thank you, Chris. And, of course, anytime you're in town, stop by, and I'm sure we're going to have more of these conversations as we gear towards that GOP primary.
That sounds great. Reach out anytime.
All right, thank you.